Between 1939 and 1945, the world was locked in a nightmare struggle of unprecedented ferocity. When the smoke finally cleared, stories emerged of an extraordinary array of new weapons dreamed up by both sides' most inventive minds. Weird weapons unlike anything used in warfare before. New ways of bringing destruction to the enemy, born of desperation and wild imagination. And when the world had gone mad, nothing seemed too strange to try. An unsinkable, indestructible aircraft carrier made from solid ice, floating in the middle of the Atlantic. American bats, trained to carry tiny incendiary bombs designed to set fire to entire Japanese cities. Bombs so unbelievably large and powerful, they could bury themselves in the ground and trigger earthquakes. On the Allied side, some of the most extreme ideas were born in the dark early days of World War II. From the beginning, through 1941 and 42, Allied merchant ships carrying vital supplies from the U.S. to Britain were under constant attack. In 1942, German U-boats reaped a grim harvest. They were sinking an average of 33 merchant ships a week. The cost in human terms was enormous. 30,000 U.S. seamen alone were killed or injured in the North Atlantic during the war. Hundreds of miles of open sea were a free-fire zone for the Germans.
If you flew out from Great Britain, you could only fly so far to cover the convoys going across the Atlantic. You could only fly so far out of, say, Halifax in Nova Scotia. And there was this zone in between the air cover where the U-boats could operate and operate without having to fear air cover.
What was needed was a mid-Atlantic floating platform to serve as an airbase to defend the convoys. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered his staff to put their minds to the problem. An eccentric scientist working for the British Combined Operations Department called Geoffrey Pike came up with an extraordinary and improbable solution.
What Pike thought he had was a whole concept of winning the war using icebergs. It wasn't just as airfields. He even had the idea of building great 4,000-foot, 4-million-ton rams that would ram their way into enemy harbors.
Pike's first idea was bold, simple, and dramatic. Cut out a section of an iceberg and tow it to the mid-Atlantic to use as a floating airfield large enough to support a landing strip, a fuel depot, and anti-aircraft guns. In an increasingly beleaguered Britain, the idea was seized upon with enthusiasm. Churchill was so taken by the concept, he said, "The advantages of a floating island are so dazzling, at the moment they do not need to be discussed." But when Pike and his colleagues looked at the idea in detail, they realized it wasn't that easy.
The problem, of course, with any iceberg, if you have 10% above, you have 90% below. And the Admiralty had determined you needed a 50-foot freeboard to launch aircraft off of successfully, which means you have nearly 500 feet below. And that wasn't practical.
Undaunted, Geoffrey Pike was still convinced that ice was the key to building some kind of floating platform for the mid-Atlantic. Pike saw another huge advantage in using ice as a building block. It floats, and you can't sink it.
Just above freezing, water suddenly begins to expand. And that crucial fact, the expansion of water in the last stages of its solidifying, means that ice is less dense than water and therefore always floats.
So Pike came up with something even better. Maybe you could use ice with all its qualities to build a ship. He called it a berg ship and produced drawings and plans to show what it could be like. The The large cavernous hull would contain aircraft hangars, fuel tanks, stores, living accommodation, ammunition bunkers for aircraft, and a refrigeration plant.
It would almost have been a floating town. It would have been big enough to have 150 aircraft on it at any one time. An extraordinary structure.
A regular engine would be too hot for an ice ship. Instead, it was to be electrically powered by a 32,000 horsepower generator, driving 20 individual propellers. But above all, the ice hull would be 40 feet thick, rendering the ship unsinkable.
A ship of conventional thickness would be, even of ice, would still sink. Or at least it would roll over and list and cause problems. So 40-foot thick walls could not be penetrated by torpedoes, and they would be repairable while still at sea.
Churchill figured this could be the solution to his greatest problem, the lethal U-boats. But to build something of this magnitude out of ice, he would need help. Across the Atlantic, Canada had both the climate and resources to build a frozen ice ship. Churchill approached the Canadian Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, and persuaded him to build a prototype 1/10 the size of the intended ice ship. Work began at the beginning of winter, late in 1942 at Patricia Lake in northern Canada.
It was the mother of all ice cubes, and it looked like a big boathouse. The Mennonites who worked on it told us that they called it Noah's Ark. Setting up the prototype was to just see if it was feasible. Could you keep a block of ice that large frozen? Would it in fact float at the level you wanted it to float at?
And it worked. They kept the ice frozen with refrigeration equipment that they installed on board, and it lasted all through the winter and all through the following summer.
As they began construction, a serious problem emerged. In its natural state, ice is very tough. As a building material, it's not so good. It breaks. Back to Jeffrey Pike, researching by now in New York, always thinking out of the box. He came across a new invention called macro-reinforced ice, and it was stronger than concrete.
Basically, it was wood chips, wood shavings mixed in with the ice and then frozen. They could turn it on a lathe, they could hammer it, they could saw it, and it resisted melting.
This reinforced ice was developed at the Brooklyn Polytechnic. The inventor, a scientist called Dr. Herman Mark, called it Pikecrete, in honor of Jeffrey Pike.
Pikecrete turned out to have just the very properties you'd need for a floating airstrip. And because of the wood pulp, it tended not to melt as quickly as native ice would melt.
Churchill's mind was made up. An indestructible ship made from Pikecrete was a weapon which could win him the war. It was to be called Habakkuk, after an Old Testament prophet who had written,
I will work the work in your days, which ye shall not believe, though it be told to you.
This Habakkuk would be 2 million tons in weight and nearly a half mile in length. It would move through the water at a sedate 7 knots, secure in the knowledge that any number of torpedoes would barely dent its 40-foot thick hull.
What you would have done would be to blow little craters out of the surface, but it would have been quite impossible to significantly destroy it.
Churchill was so excited, he wanted not just one ship, but a fleet of 100, and he wanted them soon. But just as this incredibly weird concept appeared to be in his grasp, it was snatched away. Late in 1943, Churchill was told the builders weren't even sure they could get one made within 2 years, let alone 100.
I think there were several reasons why the project was abandoned. Firstly, it was